For 21 seasons, something profoundly unusual happened on public television. A soft-spoken man in a plaid shirt would walk into a workshop, put on his safety glasses, and proceed to build furniture while explaining each cut, each joint, and each mistake he avoided. There were no explosions, no contract negotiations playing out on camera, no judges delivering cruel verdicts, and no celebrity cameos. The new Yankee Workshop, which aired from 1989 to 2009, was the anti-reality show before anyone even coined that term. It was simply a master craftsman doing masterful work, and millions of people watched him do it every single week. The show remained profitable, fully funded by sponsors like Delta Machinery and Sears, and beloved by a loyal audience that spanned generations. So when the announcement came in October of 2009 that no further episodes would be produced, fans were not just disappointed, they were genuinely confused. The show had not declined in quality. Norm Abram had not lost his touch. There was no scandal, no network feud, and no ratings collapse. The real reason Norm Abram walked away from the workshop he built into an American institution was far simpler, far more human, and far more quietly dignified than anyone speculated at the time. To understand why the show ended, you first have to understand what made it so extraordinarily durable. The new Yankee Workshop was the brainchild of Russell Morash, the legendary producer who had already revolutionized television with this old house. Morash had watched Norm Abram work as the lead carpenter on that show for years, and he noticed something that went beyond technical skill. Norm had a peculiar gift for making complex joinery feel approachable. He could explain a mortise and tenon joint in a way that made a beginner feel capable while still teaching a professional something new. Morash recognized that this was not merely teaching, it was a form of quiet charisma that television rarely captures. So he built Norm his own stage, a 936-square-foot workshop tucked behind a farmhouse in Massachusetts, equipped with every tool a serious woodworker could desire, but arranged with the simplicity of a working shop, not a television set. The format was almost aggressively straightforward. Norm would introduce a project, often visiting a historical landmark to study an original piece of Shaker or Chippendale furniture. He would examine its construction, note its peculiarities, and then return to the workshop to build a reproduction from scratch. No time-lapse shortcuts that hid the difficult parts. No second crew building a backup version off camera. Just Norm, his tools, and a running commentary that never talked down to the audience. The show aired on PBS, which meant it was immune to the rating-chasing desperation that corrupted commercial television. There was no pressure to introduce drama, no demand for younger hosts, no need to reinvent the format every few seasons. The show simply existed, doing the same thing at the same pace, and that consistency became its superpower. By the mid-1990s, the new Yankee Workshop had become a Saturday morning ritual for an astonishingly diverse audience. Retired craftsmen watched to see how Norm handled a tricky dovetail. Young fathers watched to learn how to build a crib. Office workers, who had never held a chisel, watched because something about the show was genuinely therapeutic. In an era of accelerating culture, where every television program seemed to scream for attention, Norm Abram offered something radical: permission to slow down. His voice never rose above a calm instructional tone. His hands never moved faster than precision required. And he reminded you at the start of every single episode to protect your eyes. A small ritual that somehow became as comforting as a prayer. What the audience saw was 22 minutes of peaceful, methodical woodworking. What the audience did not see was the 40 to 60 hours of preparation and filming required to produce those 22 minutes. Each episode demanded that Norm design a build process that would work on television, which meant deciding which steps could be compressed and which needed to be shown in full. It meant sourcing lumber in specific species and dimensions, often traveling to multiple suppliers to find boards with the right grain and no hidden defects. It meant setting up camera angles, lighting adjustments, and tool placements so that every cut was visible without obstructing Norm's movement. And at the center of all that logistical complexity, Norm still had to build the piece. For real. With real wood. With real consequences if he made a mistake. This is the detail that separates the new Yankee workshop from every imitation that followed. Norm was not performing carpentry, he was doing carpentry, under the unforgiving glare of television lights, with no opportunity to reshoot a failed joint because the lumber would already be cut. If a tenon was too tight, he fixed it himself. If a board split unexpectedly, he figured out a repair on the spot. There were no stand-ins, no off-camera specialists, no second version of the project quietly swapped in during editing. The authenticity viewers sensed was not a production trick. It was the genuine article, and it came at a genuine cost. The physical environment of the workshop was beautiful to look at, but brutal to work in. The floor was bare concrete, chosen for durability and easy cleanup, but offering no cushioning whatsoever. Norm stood on that concrete for 8 to 12 hours a day during production seasons, which ran for several months each year. He did this for 21 consecutive years. The repetitive motions of sawing, chiseling, planing, and sanding, performed thousands of times, gradually wore on his joints. His back, bent over workbenches and heavy lumber, accumulated its own quiet debt, and the concrete floor eventually produced a chronic case of plantar fasciitis, a painful inflammation of the tissue that connects the heel to the toes. None of this ever appeared on camera. Norm was not the kind of man who complained, and he certainly was not the kind of man who let his audience see him struggle. The show remained as calm and unhurried in its final season as it had been in its first, which is precisely why no one saw the ending coming. What compounded the physical toll was the simple fact that the new Yankee workshop was never Norm's only job. Throughout the entire run of the show, he continued working as the master carpenter on this old house, which operated on an entirely separate production schedule with different locations, different crews, and different demands. For more than 2 decades, Norm effectively held 2 full-time television jobs simultaneously, both of which required physical labor and technical precision. The difference between the 2 roles was the weight each one carried. On this old house, Norm was a vital contributor, but he was part of a team. He could share the load, advise younger workers, and focus on specific challenges without carrying the entire production. On the new Yankee workshop, he was everything. He was the designer, the builder, the teacher, the host, and the sole on-screen talent. If Norm did not show up ready to perform at his highest level, there was no episode. That level of responsibility is exhausting in any profession. In a physically demanding trade, performed on camera for 21 years, it was unsustainable. The conversations about ending the show did not begin suddenly. They built gradually, as the physical costs became harder to ignore. Norm had turned 60 in 2009, and while 60 is not elderly, it is an age at which decades of repetitive physical labor announce their cumulative weight. The plantar fasciitis made standing for long hours increasingly painful. The joint issues made some movements stiff in the morning. His back reminded him regularly that he had been bending over workbenches since the Carter administration. Russell Morash, who had been with the show from its first episode, and whose own backyard had housed the workshop, later confirmed that the decision was entirely Norm's. There was no pressure from WGBH, the producing station. There was no threat of cancellation from PBS. The sponsors remained willing. The audience remained loyal. The only question was what the show was costing Norm to continue, and whether that cost had become too high. The announcement came on October 16, 2009, and it was classic Norm Abram direct, unemotional, and devoid of spectacle. WGBH Boston released a brief statement confirming that no further episodes would be produced. Norm added his own comment, equally brief, saying only that they had enjoyed a great run, built challenging projects, and received loyal support from millions of viewers. There was no farewell special, no final episode with a ribbon tied around it, no tearful goodbye to the cameras. The show simply ended, the way Norm had always worked, without unnecessary ceremony, and with everything already said that needed to be said. In the years since, various rumors have circulated about the show's demise. Some speculated about behind-the-scenes feuds between Norm and the production team. Others suggested declining viewership or a loss of sponsors. A few even proposed that Norm had been pushed out to make room for a younger host. All of these theories are false, contradicted by every person who worked on the show and by the plain facts of the show's continued success. The new Yankee workshop was not canceled. It was ended, deliberately, thoughtfully, and entirely on Norm's own terms. Russell Morash put it simply, the show could not continue without Norm. There was no version of the new Yankee workshop that made sense with anyone else at the workbench. The show was not a format that could be handed to a successor. It was a specific man doing a specific thing in a specific way, and the decision to end it was inseparable from Norm's decision about his own life and his own body. Morash also noted something rarely mentioned in discussions of the show's ending. Norm had unfinished projects of his own. His timber-framed colonial home in Carlisle, Massachusetts, which he had built himself, still had details he had never found time to complete. There were built-ins he had always intended to add. There were repairs and improvements he had postponed for years because the show consumed so much of his production energy. Ending the new Yankee workshop was not a retreat from woodworking. It was finally making space to do woodworking on his own terms, for himself and his family, without cameras or deadlines or the accumulated pressure of being the entire foundation of a major television production. The announcement landed like a genuine shock, even among viewers who had followed the show for decades. Most long-running television programs decline visibly before they end. The quality dips. The cast changes. The audience feels the approaching conclusion and has time to prepare. The new Yankee workshop offered no such warning. The final season had been as strong as any previous season. Norm had not slowed down, at least not in ways visible to the camera. The projects remained challenging. The instruction remained clear. The show had simply been doing what it always did, and then it stopped. Message boards and woodworking forums lit up within hours of the announcement. Fine Woodworking magazine, which had covered the show throughout its entire run, reported that reader response was unlike anything they had seen in response to a television news story. People were not merely sad about losing a program. They were writing the kinds of messages you write when you lose something that had been genuinely woven into the rhythm of your life. Veteran woodworkers credited the show with rekindling passions they had almost abandoned. Beginners described how Norm's patient instruction had given them the confidence to attempt their first real project. High school shop teachers wrote about students who had come to woodworking specifically because of what they had seen on Saturday morning television. Parents described watching episodes with their children, and those children, now adults, wrote about still remembering which projects they had watched together. What the fan reaction revealed, more clearly than any rating number could, was that the new Yankee workshop had not merely entertained people. It had shaped how they spent their time, what they valued, and how they thought about the act of making something with their hands. That is an extraordinarily rare thing for any television show to accomplish, and it is rarer still for a show that operated without drama, without scandal, and without any form of self-promotion. Norm Abram never asked for attention. He never cultivated a persona. He never appeared on talk shows or granted revealing interviews. He simply did his work, and the audience responded to that work with a loyalty that bordered on devotion. Notably, the fan reaction was almost entirely free of anger. There was grief, certainly, and a sense of loss, but it was the kind of grief that comes with respect. People understood, even without knowing the specific details of Norm's physical situation, that he had given what he had to give. The show had received more from him than most television productions receive from anyone. Asking for more would have been unreasonable, and the audience largely seemed to know that. The legacy of the new Yankee workshop is difficult to measure fully, in part because it worked so quietly and asked so little attention for itself. It never dominated headlines. It never generated cultural controversy. It never became the subject of think pieces or academic conferences. It just showed up, every Saturday for 21 seasons, and taught people how to build things. And somewhere in that consistency, it changed how a generation thought about craft, skill, and the value of making something with your own hands. The approximately 235 projects Norm built on screen remain as relevant today as the day they were filmed. Shaker side tables, Windsor chairs, blanket chests, bookcases, and Chippendale mirrors. These are not dated styles. They are classic forms that endure because they are honest, built without ornamentation that hides poor joinery, designed to last for generations rather than impress for a season. Norm did not just teach people how to build those pieces. He taught people why those pieces were worth building, which is a different and more lasting kind of education. The show's project plans, available for purchase throughout its run, gave viewers a direct path from watching to doing. Thousands of people built Norm's exact projects in their own shops, following the same dimensions and techniques demonstrated on screen. Some of those pieces are now in their second generation of family ownership. Real objects in real homes that exist because a man on a PBS program took the time to show how they were made. In January 2023, more than 13 years after the show ended, Russell Morash announced that all episodes were available to watch for free on YouTube. The response was immediate and overwhelming. A new generation of viewers discovered the show, as if for the first time, people in their 20s and 30s who had never owned a VHS tape or watched a broadcast television schedule. They found Norm Abram and responded with the same quiet admiration every generation before them had. The comment sections filled with letters of gratitude. People described staying up until 2 in the morning watching episodes, ordering their first set of chisels after a single build, discovering that woodworking was the most calming and rewarding thing they had ever attempted. The show had been off the air for over a decade, and it was still doing what it had always done, making people want to go make something. Ending the new Yankee workshop did not mean the end of Norm Abram's public life. He continued working on this old house, where his role as master carpenter was far more sustainable than carrying an entire production alone. Instead of designing, building, teaching, and hosting every episode, he contributed his expertise as part of a team, advising younger carpenters, demonstrating specific techniques, and appearing in a supporting role that allowed him to stay connected to both the craft and the audience without the same physical demands. For the first time in years, he also had space to focus on his own projects. The timber-framed Colonial in Carlisle finally received the attention it deserved. He built the built-ins he had always intended. He made repairs at his own pace, without a camera crew waiting. He returned to woodworking on his own terms, quieter, slower, and personal. He also continued writing, producing books and articles that extended the same clear, practical teaching style that had defined his television work. In 2016, he appeared in Felled, a documentary about giving new life to fallen urban trees, a natural extension of how he had always viewed wood, not merely as material, but as something with history and meaning. Then, in 2022, after more than 4 decades on television, Norm officially retired from this old house as well. The send-off matched everything about him. It was quiet, respectful, and entirely without spectacle. A brief acknowledgement, a thank you from the production team, and then a graceful exit. Even now, the original workshop still stands behind that Massachusetts farmhouse, and Norm still visits from time to time, not to film, not to perform, but simply to build. So what was the real reason the new Yankee workshop ended? The answer is almost disappointingly simple, which is probably why so many people have searched for more complicated explanations. Norm Abram gave the show everything he had for 21 years. He worked 40 to 60 hours a week on top of another demanding television job, stood on a concrete floor for thousands of hours, performed repetitive physical labor long past the point where his body wished he would stop, and never once let the audience see the cost. When his body finally made it clear that the cost had become too high, he listened. He did not wait for a dramatic breakdown. He did not push through until he injured himself seriously. He did not hand the show off to a younger host in a doomed attempt to preserve the format. He simply ended it, on his own terms, with gratitude, and without complaint. That decision reveals something important about Norm Abram that his on-screen persona only hinted at. He was not driven by ego. He was not chasing fame or legacy. He was a craftsman who who happened to appear on television, not a television personality who happened to know woodworking. When the work stopped being sustainable, he stopped doing it. There was no farewell tour, no retrospective documentary, no merchandising push to squeeze the last value from the brand. There was just a quiet announcement and then silence, followed by years of fans still watching reruns, still buying his books, still building his projects, and still recommending the show to their children. The real reason the new Yankee workshop ended is that Norm Abram was exactly who he appeared to be. A man who took pride in doing things right, who respected his audience enough to never fake a cut or hide a mistake, and who respected himself enough to know when to walk away. In an era of relentless self-promotion, manufactured drama, and desperate attempts to stay relevant, that is perhaps the rarest quality of all. The show ended because the man at its center had nothing left to prove and nothing more to give, and he was honest enough to admit it. The new Yankee workshop is gone, but its influence has not faded. It lives on in every woodworker who still hears Norm's voice reminding them to measure twice and cut once. It lives on in every piece of furniture built from those old project plans, now scattered across garages and basements and home workshops throughout the country. It lives on in the simple, radical idea that skill matters, that patience is a virtue, and that a man doing honest work is worth watching, even without explosions or eliminations or celebrity judges. The workshop still stands in Massachusetts. The tools are still in their places, and on quiet days, if you listen closely, you can still hear the sound of a master craftsman doing what he loved, one careful cut at a time. The only difference is that now, finally, he is doing it just for himself.